Hello and welcome to the Political Frontline. My special guest today is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation, Andreas Umland. Hello, Andreas.
Hello, Denis.
Andreas, military actions in the temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk regions remains at high level. International observers, including the representative from OSCE, confirmed the use of illegal heavy artillery. What is the aim of all these actions?
Well, I think the aim for the Kremlin, for the current Russian leadership, is to keep Ukraine in an undetermined situation, to use these regions to destabilize the country, to prevent investors from coming, especially to the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine and southern and eastern Ukraine, and to create a depressive situation in these regions beyond the Donetsk basin, beyond the occupied territories, and those to prepare, so to say, these regions for a future takeover. I think that's the long-term strategy. I don't think we will see a full-scale military attack in the soon future, but we will see, I'm afraid, these attempts to destabilize the situation, to keep the economy down, to scare investors away.
I think it's not all about investors, but as you have mentioned, this is all about destabilizing the Ukraine. But many foreigners and many Ukrainian politicians talk about the peaceful negotiation process in Donbas and Lugansk region. Do you believe that this process can be feasible?
Well, it can be if there is a change of mind in Moscow. I think that's the crucial question here. And the calculation is that as time goes on, as the direct effects of the sanctions, the indirect effects of the sanctions have more and more impact on the Russian economy, on the Russian society, and also on Russian politics, that eventually there will be a change of mind, an attempt by the Kremlin to create a trustworthy, a trustful situation again between Russia and the West, and to encourage again Western investment, for instance, in Russia, Western trade with Russia. And then I think we will see also a change in the negotiations, and indeed then there might be a chance for peace.
As you have mentioned about the Western investors, does the Western investors, including investors from USA, understand that war in Ukraine is only on Donbas and Lugansk region, not on the whole country?
Well, I think most investors or most business people who I know are here in Ukraine. They see the difference between the Donetsk basin and basically the Russian-speaking, largely Russian-speaking regions in the south and east on the one side, and the rest of the country, central Ukraine, western Ukraine, on the other side. But nevertheless, of course, the situation as a whole remains unstable, and this instability is not good for business, is not good for investment. I think this is exactly the calculation of the Kremlin, to win this war, so to say, not by purely military means, but if you like, by psychological means, by leaving investors, leaving politicians, journalists, analysts in limbo, unclear about what's happening here, what is the future for Ukraine, and therefore undermining, and by this way undermining the Ukrainian state.
To avoid possible military deterioration, the Normandy 4 group has met in Paris at the end of June, and they has concluded that there is no military solution for the existing conflict. Don't you think that this is the signal that conflict can be frozen?
Well, I agree that there is no military solution. I think there is no realistic chance for, let's say, the Ukrainian army to be victorious against the Russian army. I think we have to acknowledge that. A frozen conflict might indeed emerge as time goes on. Maybe it is not actually the worst result, because an unfrozen conflict would be in a way worse than a frozen conflict. But a frozen conflict would of course mean non-implementation of the Minsk agreements, and it would mean that Russia is again not observing its international agreements, its international obligations that it has signed by itself, as we had before with the Geneva Agreement, with the Budapest Memorandum, with many other agreements between Ukraine and Russia. And I suppose that this will have the negative effects on Russia in terms of the political isolation, diplomatic isolation, and also economic isolation. And finally, it will create domestic problems for Russia. And this is, so to say, the hope that of the West, that the prospect of a domestic destabilization in Russia will bring the Kremlin to its mind and will make it more accommodative and eventually resolve the situation in the Donetsk.
Okay, you have mentioned that there is no military resolution of this conflict. But do you think that there is politic way of resolution?
Well, I think political.
Because as we see all this meeting, all these conferences and forums about all these conflicts, I mean Crimea and the east of Ukraine, they are not realistic at all.
Yeah, indeed, the diplomacy has shown itself to be, let's put it cautiously, ineffective. We had lots of diplomacy over the last year. Lots of telephone calls, lots of meetings, conferences, and so on, and they have unfortunately not brought the results that many Western leaders expected to see, because they had all these conversations with Russian leaders, with President Putin, with the foreign minister, with other representatives of Russia. In that way, I think in the West also many understand that there is no purely diplomatic solution to this. I think one can speak of a political solution in a way that economic sanctions and the general mood of distrust around Russia that is currently rising, that is scaring away also Western investors from Russia, Western trade partners from Russia, that is sort of creating insecurity also for Russia in the international scene, that this will eventually create political pressure inside Russia for a change in foreign policy.
As you have mentioned about the economy and business, Ukraine continues to move forward with its reforms agenda. In particular, there was progress in ensuring the country's financial stability, accelerating anti-corruption efforts, and implementing energy sector reforms. What is your impression from Ukrainian reforms?
Well, there are some reforms, and they are impressive indeed. Some of them here on the streets of Kiev, you can see, for instance, the new police, which is, I think, quite important reform. And this is, of course, just a pilot project in the center of Kiev.
But this is police. This is a small drop in the ocean.
Yes, but it's a start, and it's an example for how the whole police of Ukraine should look someday, and it has started, and it's going on, and I think it's now on the move. And also in other sectors we have seen these reforms, but they're too slow, and they are not impressive enough, and there's a lot of fight also against reforms in the parliament. There's the oligarchs are fighting back. There's a lot of resistance in the bureaucracy of the government, but that's in a way natural. I think that was maybe to be expected, and there's still a lot of work to do. But I think many in the West acknowledge that there was some progress, and considering the complicated situation of Ukraine today and the war in the East, the progress is actually substantial.
We will have a small pause, and then we will continue our program. My guest today is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation, Andreas Umland. Andreas, continue our program. What about European politics? What's their opinion on Ukraine reforms?
I think the view of the West and the European politicians today on Ukraine is that Ukraine is in a difficult situation, that it has to fight several wars, if you like. It has sort of an internal fight for reforms. It has its war in the Donetsk basin, and it has to reform itself internally. It has to reposition itself internationally. And that considering the multiplicity of these challenges and the complications that Ukraine is currently facing, the record is not so bad, considering the circumstances. But of course, there are also many problems in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the humanitarian sphere as well. And the reforms could have been more consistent, faster, more effective. I think there's still a lot to do.
Let's talk about the weapons. The President of the United States of America thinks that army in Ukraine will lead to escalating, to the escalation. And at the end, all the world will have a threat of war between Russia and NATO. Do you support this statement or not? Do you agree with him?
I wouldn't say I agree or I disagree. There are lots of fears in the West now. Basically, it all comes down that it looks as if this conflict could become World War III, and that it could actually also then touch directly upon the European Union, the US, and so on. And that is, I think, the fear that is behind it. It's also a fear that is, I think, purposefully created by Russia. It's a sort of poker game. I think with the weapons, I think it's a complicated question. On the one hand, one could have here a logic saying that if Ukraine gets defensive weapons, this would soothe the situation because it would make it more costly for Russia to further escalate the situation, for instance, to conduct a new invasion of, let's say, Mariupol or southeastern Ukraine. On the other hand, the delivery of weapons, especially of American weapons, will of course also be noticed in Russia, and it will of course be exploited by the Russian propaganda, and that may actually increase the Russian public's support for direct Russian military involvement in the conflict. And if the Russian public starts thinking that Russia should actually officially, so to say, militarily support the so-called separatists in the Donetsk basin, this would be also a complicated situation. Therefore, I interpret these signals in not only from the US but also in many European countries that do not want to deliver weapons to Ukraine in this way. That what they fear is that actually this would then trigger a change of mood in the Russian public that would then see Ukraine as a threat, Ukraine armed with Western weapons as a sort of outpost of NATO, and then would actually support direct Russian military official Russian military involvement in the Donetsk basin.
So you think it's all about the public support? Because, you know, there is many surveys in Russia that says that 80 or even 90% supporting the policy of Putin. Mm-hmm. So I think we can't expect more than 90% or 80.
Yes. Putin, as a politician, has a high support, and the annexation of Crimea has also an enormously high support. But if you look on other figures, then support for a Russian-Ukrainian war is significantly lower, and most Russians are still against a Russian-Ukrainian war. They live in the parallel world where there is no such war, while there is actually a covert war already between Russia and Ukraine in eastern Ukraine. And as long as the public mood in Russia remains critical towards an official Russian involvement in this conflict, it has a restraining, constraining effect on the Kremlin's policies. However, if the Kremlin manages to persuade the Russian public to support official Russian involvement in the Donetsk basin, then indeed the situation would be even more dangerous than it is today.
As you have mentioned about the economy sanctions, for example, the Chancellor Angela Merkel is positive that sanctions is the best way to win in such circumstances. What is your opinion about this? Do you support her opinion or not?
Well, I think
that sanctions is the best way.
It's considering the situation. Indeed, it's the only basically pressure or the leverage that is left to the West, because let's be frank, the Western public will not support a direct Western military involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There's simply not enough sympathy, empathy for Ukraine to support NATO troops in Ukraine. Therefore, the only instrument that is left are the economic sanctions, and they are having an effect. They are having both a direct effect in that they create concrete problems for Russian companies that want to get, for instance, cash from international banks but cannot get this cash for their businesses. But they also create lots of indirect problems, because they create a mood, as I already mentioned, of distrust and insecurity about the future of the Russian economy. And Western companies, and in general, I would say foreign companies, not only Western companies, have come to see Russia as a much more risky investment place, as a much less trustworthy state. And this will eventually have an effect on Russia. It has already an effect on the economy, and sooner or later it will also have an effect on the social sphere and on the political sphere.
Can we talk about the European consensus concerning these sanctions? I mean the whole Europe.
Yes, there is. As one could see with the last extension of the current sanctions, there is a consensus. There are, of course, different opinions. There are simply countries in the European Union that are less empathetic. They are more pro-Russian. They basically buy the Russian argument about this whole escalation. But still, they are so far in line with the mainstream, so to say, EU policies towards Russia. And for the time being, at least for the rest of the year, the sanctions will be upheld, and the Russian economy will be affected by it.
What can you say about the Russian lobby in European Union? Is it strong or not? Because, as you know, there is much friends in Europe of Russia. I mean Greece and so on.
I think there used to be lots of friends of Russia in Europe, and there are still some, but I think their numbers have gone down significantly. Basically, 2014 has been a public relations disaster for Russia in countries like Germany, in other important countries in Europe. And there's now considerably less support for the position of Putin. The Russian leadership has become unpopular, and it's not trusted anymore.
But Russian money is still popular in Europe.
Well, all money is popular everywhere. I think that's not something peculiar, but even Russian money is now looked upon in a different way. It's seen with much less trust and much less optimism than there was before, because it's not any longer clear what this Russian money actually means, how sustainable, for instance, Russian investment will be in EU countries. And therefore, at least in mainstream European politics, basically in all of the countries, with the possible exceptions of countries like Greece and Cyprus, I think Russia has lost enormously in terms of its support. And that's why it's now turning to marginal parties, first of all to right radical parties, to quite radical, not just right wing, but right radical parties. Even the moderately right wing parties are not supportive anymore of Russia, also the moderately left-wing parties, and there's still some support on the radical left as well for Russia, but the main sort of support group of Russia today is the radical right in the European Parliament, in the national parliaments. But this is a problematic support because this is a group of politicians, of parties that is sort of outside the mainstream. It's stigmatized, and it actually creates even more public relations, public image problems for Russia, that it is associated with these ultranationalist, right-wing extremist and partly even fascist parties.
So Andreas, on that note, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation, Andreas Umland, thanks for being on Political Frontline.
Thanks for having me.